Hey friends, welcome back to the Lightcast. Today we're going to be talking about the Kokiri and whether or not they are actually Hylian. The idea for this topic was posed by a person who commented on my statistical analysis of errors and problems in the Gauss collection books. And I thought it was really interesting. I've had a theory in the back of my mind for a good couple years now that I've not really covered because frankly, it contains some pretty difficult information, so content warning. One of the things that we're going to be talking about is death and spiritual beliefs related to that, specifically for Shinto practitioners. So with that out of the way, let's dive in. One of the claims that is made in Daka's question is that the Kokiri are actually Hylians, and I believe that they are, and I want to get into it. There's a lot of layers to this, so logically I think a good place to start would be talking about just some of the existing myth and mythos. I'm not going to go too deep in that because it's so well known at this point, but this is just kind of like a catch-up. And essentially, the idea is that, not going of time, one of the things you find out is that if, according to legend, if a Kokiri were to leave the forest, they would die, and if they were to come into the forest, or if the Kokiri were to venture into the Lost Woods, they would become like the Skull Child. If you haven't seen it, Monster Maze actually has a very, very good video about the topic and unpacking whether or not the myth is even true. It's really cool and fascinating. I would highly recommend it. I'm going to drop a link to that in the description for this. As for whether the legend is true or not, I'm not as interested in that nearly as much as I am the origin of why it's there to start with and how it made its way into the game. So there's a couple of things that interplay with this. There's actually a couple of different beliefs that kind of like intertwine here to make one cohesive story about the Kokiri, and by extension, the Koroks throughout the series. In Japan, for at least people who are Shinto practitioners, there are beliefs around what happens whenever a child passes on from an early age, or at an early age, rather. One of those beliefs is that if a child should have experienced an untimely death via a couple different types of means, they would be stuck by a river stacking rocks for eternity. And demons would come along and knock those rocks over, and they would have to stack them again and again. The rock stacking part of that is a really big detail that's worth keeping a focus on. We're going to talk about that in a little bit with regards to the Koroks, especially in the Air of the Wilds. So the children are restacking these rocks, and then there's this kami that goes by the name of Jizō, who comes along and like takes those children under his robe and in protection from the demons, and just acts like a guardian for those children that have unfortunately passed away. On the flip side of that, there's also various myths and beliefs about what happens in forests, especially like eternal forests. And one of those is that if a person should die in the forest, or even sometimes in the case where some people like wander into the forest, one of the things that can happen is if they die in the forest, they can become a spirit there, and they can become a kami themselves, or dure, which would be like a spirit who has unfinished business. For people who wander into forests, if they are pure enough, they can actually become a spirit throughout the process of wandering through the forest. Similarly, there's also beliefs and myths about leaving a forest if you are there already. And one of those is that when you leave, the further away that you get from a forest, the spirit may fade as they lose their memory of who they were. They become like lost souls, if you will. At some point, I would like to explore the possibility of that for the pose. But sticking to this topic, before ADHD takes us on an adventure that I'm not sure how this one may go on, they can disappear. And then there's another state too where they can become in this in-between, like not really living but also not dead, and don't become kami, and they become stuck in this like endless wandering. Especially Okigahara, that particular forest. And I think you can kind of see the foundation of the myth there, with the difference being that, and so turning into a spirit, like say you're just an average person, like an adult who wanders into the Kokiri forest instead of a spirit, like they've seemingly swapped that out with what would be Astolfos. And then on the other side of that myth, of course, you have the once you're there, leaving makes you disappear. I think that this is where this comes from, essentially. And then I keep delving towards the point that I'm ultimately going for, which is answering the question of why do I think that the Kokiri are still Highlands? Back on the flip side of this, like the spiritual beliefs and whatnot, there are also some other practices that you'll find. One common thing that happens whenever for children who are just lost is the placement of colorful pinwheels around Jizō statues. If you haven't realized where I'm going with this by now, or if you haven't played these particular games that are just never really picked up on it, of course, you have Koroks and the Heir of the Wilds. Pinwheels are sometimes a trigger for getting a Korok seed, and that couples really, really well and strongly with the whole fact that some of the puzzles to get a Korok seed actually involve changing the configuration of rocks that are on the ground. I think that both of those things are a nod to this, and while Koroks, while the Pinwheels are actually a trigger for starting those quests in the Heir of the Wilds, that's not the only game that they take place in, or like the Pinwheels, I mean. Pinwheels can actually be found on Skyloft, and it's kind of neat that that part of Japanese culture has made its way into the game, because I think that it is a very tender topic, but it also touches on some things that are, that's a really interesting way of integrating it. And it does feel like gentle remembrance that might cause you to, that also kind of couples with a mechanic that is designed to get you to explore the world a little bit more. There's other parts to this too. So back before time splits, of course the Kokiri are associated strongly to wind. And of course Makara is also associated to wind too, but that's kind of the end of the story for the association to the Kokiri and the Koroks, because as other games have come out in the series that took place before, you see that the Wind Tribe is a whole other different group of people. But the tie of wind to the Kokiri and the Koroks is actually still interrelated to that too. In some traditional beliefs, one of the things where wind is associated back to spirits in the forest specifically are that for sacred trees, whenever wind is blown through it, it's said to be believed that a kami was nearby. There's also other aspects to this too, where whenever you hear sounds in the forest that maybe you didn't expect, like someone's voice or an echo of a sound that shouldn't be there, that those may be just tricks that are being played by Kodama, like forest spirits essentially. And then to talk about Kodama for a moment, they, of course, their appearance, if you look at some of the depictions of Kodama, especially in Miyazaki films, and then weirdly enough, the tries also kind of have a Kodama-like appearance to them in the same kind of style of the way that they're depicted in Miyazaki movies. This ends up resulting in a thing where it's like you can kind of see all these myths like converging to create a general story and rules in what we see across other games, no matter who it involves. And in the Heir of the Wilds, one of the things that we do see too is that there are the small statues all over Hyrule. And if you looked at them and assumed that they were like miniature goddess statues, I wouldn't blame you, because that's exactly what I felt they were at first. But they're actually Jesus statues. So Jesus, it would be also a guardian traveler deity. So that's what those are, just to really drive that home too. To take it a step further, the assets for those particular models are actually also named Traveler Guardian Deities or Guardian Traveler Deities. One of those I haven't looked in a while. So you have those spread all over the place, and then of course if you look at what's happening, you offer like an apple to them whenever they show up, and like if there's 3, you offer 3 and so on. And then you usually get Korok Seed, and some of that is related to giving those offerings to the spirits of the forest, and in this case it's like actually to the children who have passed on, and their spirits are what remain. What I do think is going on here is that the Kokiri and the Koroks represent the children who have passed on in Hyrule, either due to various calamities or war. I think that's certainly would explain why there's like an abundance at the point of Ocarina of Time, which is said to have been preceded by a civil war that lasted for ages uncounted or something to that effect. If you look at the abundance of Koroks in Heir of the Wilds, for example, knowing what happened and what has happened over the last 10,000 years, whether it's the Age of Burning Fields or it's the Calamity 100 years prior to the start of Breath of the Wild, you have a good explanation for the abundance of that. The abundance of Koroks, Geralt Kingdom. So certainly, I do think that the Kokiri and the Koroks are Hylians. They're just Hylian children that have unfortunately passed on. I think that answers the central question, at least for me, and I want to stress that these are my personal beliefs. Everyone need not believe or agree with what I say. I do think it's probably right because there's enough evidence that overlaps and that aligns with what we see across many games. Before we go, I do want to touch on one thing. Why did the mother of Link take him to that forest with those myths existing? Forget whether they're true or not. Let's assume that she thought that they were true. She obviously knew that the Great Deku Tree was there, that knew that the Great Deku Tree just knew of his capabilities. So if I were to really, really speculate, say that they believed in the same myths, maybe it's the case that she believed that she was pure enough that dying in the forest wouldn't cause her to become a restless or a wandering spirit. I don't really know if that's true or not, because obviously she went there to ask the Great Deku Tree to take in Link, but there's also another aspect too where the fires of war may have been so bad that maybe she thought that the child wouldn't survive and was trying to take the baby to the forest in case the child did not make it. That could be really, really important in the context of the real world equivalent of myths that comprise this. And I could certainly see that. Like, if you thought that maybe this child didn't survive, it's better for them to end up in the care of a guardian. And I certainly think that the Great Deku Tree serves the purpose of the kami Jizō. It would make sense. It could also be the case that there wasn't that much thought put into it. I don't necessarily believe that. I think that there's a lot of intentionality in the way that those myths and legends were actually woven into the game, specifically into the forest. I think that there's a lot of intentionality. Otherwise, why include them? Why bother? So yeah, thank you so much for joining me. I hope this gave you something to think about. And if you have any questions or comments or ideas for future topics, I would of course love to hear from you. Thank you so much for giving me your time.